Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ants, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
I ran across an interesting article that raised a topic I've been thinking about for a while, and I really want to do a whole episode on it. I'll read you the headline. The FTC bans AI impersonations of individuals and unveils greater powers to win stolen money back. So the FTC, if you read into it, has decided that you cannot use AI tools to impersonate people because of all sorts of reasons. And that's fine. I actually agree with the thing for all sorts of property rights reasons. But here's what seriously bothers me and why I want to do a whole episode on this general topic. The FTC just, in effect, passed a law. Congress is supposed to pass laws.
You're decades behind the curve on this one, Ant. Decades.
I get that, but there's something going on that I don't think people appreciate, and that is that Congress has abrogated so much of its authority to these agencies. And the agencies, generally speaking, I'm not going to complain about them, broadly speaking. Thus far, they've acted in a relatively benevolent manner. What happens if tomorrow the FTC or whatever agency decides that too much screen time is bad for young people and bans the sales of phones for use by children, for example?
You're pissing into the wind on this one. And I think they have gone too far a number of times, right? You can take a look at anything OSHA does and have a pretty realistic view of what the problem is. The simple fact of the matter is the country is very big and very complex, and Congress is filled with people who aren't that bright and don't have a chance in hell at regulating things that they think should be regulated. I think the right answer is to regulate far less, not do the nonsense that we do on such a regular basis. Now, having said that, when you think about what the FTC has done here, it's hard to take issue with it, right? Because we're heading into an election season, and you're going to see all kinds of people using AI to generate all sorts of false messages from candidates for races across the country. And that's going to lead to all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
You also see how people take the image and likeness of mostly women and turn them into pornographic movies with AI. You wonder what we should do about things like that.
And again, I'm not disagreeing with this particular FTC ruling, but rather at a higher level, we think that we live in a society in which we elect representatives and representatives debate on and enact laws by vote, and it's all very democratic and so forth. And when you peel back the curtain, and this is one example of it, you find that it's not a democracy at all. In fact, one might call it a limited dictatorship, that the FTC can go and just decide this is now the law. Now, there is recourse, right? You can file suit and so forth. So that's why I put the word limited.
There's really not that much recourse, but this was an argument won and lost over 50 years ago.
So is it the case, I'll take this as item number one, of agencies being allowed to pass laws in effect? Item number two, we have a Supreme Court that for a long time has just decided what is or is not constitutional, regardless of what the plain words of the document are. And those people are once appointed, they're there for life. Is it the case that in effect we live in a, how should I say, distributed, maybe is the right word, dictatorship? There's not one guy who's calling all the shots, but there are a whole bunch of guys. And yes, some of them are, well, I guess they're all appointed, all the ones that I just named, but they're appointed by elected people. What do you call this? This isn't a democracy. This looks and acts and quacks very much like a dictatorship.
It's ruled by bureaucracy.
Ruled by bureaucracy, yeah.
We've had this for a very long time. And then, we elect the president, and it's the executive branch's duty to enforce the laws, and that includes all this nonsense. And then the executive branch, led by a president, decides whether or not they're going to do that, right? Which is why Donald Trump did pretty well once upon a time.
Yeah, but that phenomenon, you see it all the way down to the local level, where district attorneys will decide what cases they will and will not pursue.
Right.
And you might think, okay, well, you want them to have that kind of discretion. Okay, fine. But combine that with a body of law that is so broad that virtually anyone, if we pick into their lives, we can find that they've done things that are illegal. And so now you're in this situation where the DA could, in theory, just pick any guy off the street and say, okay, I'm going to enforce this law on you.
I mean, you're not wrong about any of this. It's just been the case in the United States for literally as long as we've been alive.
I'm not saying this is a new thing, but it is something I think people should be much more aware of and concerned about.
When they get concerned about it, we'll report back. I don't sense that's happening anytime soon. On that happy note, we switch gears and go to the thing that I found utterly fascinating this week. You might recall, Ant, that I made one of my very typically poor predictions during COVID when I predicted that we would have a raft of babies born.
Yes, you did. And I agreed with you.
And remember how badly that worked out. It didn't happen. Not only did it not happen at all, we went the other way.
Yeah.
Leading one to believe that perhaps when people get locked up together in tight quarters, they don't get along as well as maybe they would if they could go out from time to time and do things. But we've got some data flying in from the other direction all of a sudden, Ant, because marriage rates are presently up and divorce rates are presently down.
Really? By how much? Do you know?
For the past 2 decades, the number of marriages stayed around 7 to 8 per 1,000 people a year. In 2020, it was down to 5.1. How about that? And we seem to be on the uptick at this point. By 2022, back up to 6.2. That tells me that those marriages were planned during the lockdowns. By and large, right? I mean, surely not all of them were, but if you're seeing marriages in 2022, those were largely planned about a year and a half before that.
Yeah, they were at least thinking about it in 2020.
Yeah. In 2022, the divorce rate was 2.4 per 1,000. The lowest it had ever been in 2021 was 2.3. So we're on a downward trend with divorces too. Isn't that something? Just when you think that marriage seems to be passé,
right, yeah.
We were there for a while. All of a sudden, we've got another generation coming through, changing things around again.
I've experienced it on both sides as a young person and now observing younger people, that you look to the older generation or generations and how they did things. You say, well, we can do it better, whatever it is. Typically, it's some social thing. And you try this out, and it's not until you try it out that you find out, no, actually, they had it right. And it might take you a generation or two to get back to what was. I've made this argument before to people about the necessary balance of the liberal and conservative, that you need both of them. The liberal mindset of trying new things, because you're not going to improve if you don't, but also the conservative mindset of not throwing out the stuff that you discovered that's good simply for the sake of trying something new.
Marriage has been around for as long as human beings have been around.
Yeah, which tells you there's some reason for it.
That's right. And to throw the baby out with the bathwater there seems to be beyond silly. For whatever the reason, these things ebb and flow over time. And you and I are old enough now to have a sense of that. I mean, these were things that conservatives were losing their minds over in the last 10 years or so, that, marriage was down and divorce was up. And oh my God, what are we going to do? And we have to have all kinds of legislation protecting the family. You might recall this nonsense. But I make the same case every time. If a thing is natural and good, you don't need any legislation to protect it. You just need to leave it alone.
Right.
It looks to me exactly like that's what's happening here, that things are rebounding. And the last thing I expect to hear now is a pack of conservatives saying, see, we don't have to legislate after all.
Right.
But, dare to dream. This, of course, Ant, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And admittedly, we're a little late to this party, because we wanted to let things settle in for a minute. But Ant, you keep talking about the wonders of AI and how it's going to make our lives better. And then Google introduced AI, and it was an absolute catastrophe. Did you use the Google AI at all?
What was it called? What was its name?
Yeah, what was it called? That's a Gemini. It's called Gemini.
Oh, Gemini. No, I did not try Gemini.
I woke up one morning and I saw a bunch of people on my Twitter feed who had lost their minds, and they were asking Gemini to show pictures of the founding fathers.
Oh, I saw this, right.
and it would show a bunch of black people and Chinese people dressed up as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
And then a person I know asked it to show some German military personnel from 1943. And it showed a bunch of black people and a bunch of Asians dressed up in Nazi uniforms.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, surely it can't be that bad. And I hopped on and asked a bunch of similar questions. And don't you know, it was exactly that bad. I went a little further and I said, can you define a family for me? And it refused, saying that you can't define a family.
Clearly, it hasn't checked with Census Bureau, which does have a definition of a family.
Well, I went one better than that and hopped on ChatGPT and said, define a family for me. And it came up with a perfectly serviceable definition within, 1/10 of 1 second.
Right.
Other people ask questions like, who has done more harm to humanity, Adolf Hitler or Elon Musk? And Gemini claimed it couldn't possibly answer that question, that was too difficult, and there are shades of gray and these kinds of nonsensical things. What you start to realize is that this isn't an AI problem, it's a Google problem. The Google people are so hip deep in DEI nonsense that they can't get out of their own way when it comes to making something reasonable. Every single thing has to be a big deal to them. And as a result, they ended up with an embarrassingly useless product. The apologies started coming in. Google said, okay, we're going to retool this and we're going to get this working. But the thing I keep reading is that there's a culture of fear at Google and that you don't dare buck the party line.
How interesting.
It's clear that there's a problem with that, or this would have never have happened. This was so over the top stupid that they should have figured this out the first round of testing in-house. And this is the problem that we have, I think, with big tech. There is a monolithic culture there that is wildly out of step with the culture that the rest of the country enjoys.
It's interesting because you're saying that, and as you're talking about tech being out of step, I'm picturing Hollywood, which of course isn't tech, but
similarly out of step.
Yeah, similarly out of step, and oddly, they spring from the same geographic area.
If only one could connect the dots here. You think about the crap you get out of Hollywood lately, where every film that's been redone to highlight only female cast, when it fails, it's because of the misogyny of the audience. How often do we have to hear this nonsense before somebody smartens up and says, you know what, maybe we've missed the mark a touch here?
The ultimate arbiter in all of these things is the market. And, you started off this conversation by referring to Google's AI in the past tense. Indeed, what happens? The market looks at Google's Gemini versus ChatGPT or something else, and the market says, yeah, Gemini's nonsense. And so they go elsewhere, and what happens? Google, for all of its billions, has to pull the plug because the customer has said, no, I don't want this.
This is generally how it happens, right? The companies themselves lose their way and the people move on to something else.
Sure, and it shouldn't come as a surprise because it's been going on this way for as long as companies have existed. People saying, well, you can't fight Google because it's so big. Well, they used to say that about Microsoft. And before that, they said it about IBM.
Come on, man. They used to say it about Sears.
Yeah, and this is the thing. You'll get monolithic companies like that because they deliver what customers want. And the minute they stop delivering what customers want, they will cease to be monolithic because it's the customer that decides.
I can see the stretching on the skin of Google right now. How they react to this will determine how they do in the future. And I'm a little concerned that they're not going to react to it all that well.
Well, that's fine. There are plenty of entrepreneurs just waiting to eat their lunch.
Why are you not? Thing it's not recording. It was, and now it's not. So we're gonna go with this one. When you think about it, Ant, it's kind of dismaying, right? Because a lot of people have.
Pull it closer.
This is as close as I can get without filleting my microphone.
What happened here? Did your Rode go out?
Yeah, something just happened and it stopped recording completely. One more problem to deal with later. Huzzah. Anyway, we'd all be better off if these companies delivered. That when they don't, the problems that emerge are problems we didn't have to face. I suspect in the end that we will see the end of Google as we now understand it before too terribly long.
People are saying you're crazy. So here we are. We're recording right now, episode 372. 10 years from now, we'll refer back to it and say, James told you.
I don't think it'll be 10 years, but I take the point. And look, we've predicted this sort of thing before, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, because there's a lot of variables here. Google could right this ship, I think, relatively easily. Will they? Now I'm not so sure.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Because we've got an election season coming up, I'm always on the outlook for people trotting out the same old chestnuts that they always do. I haven't heard Joe Biden say things like, the middle class is disappearing. Why isn't he saying it? Come to find out, the Democrats have used this mantra for so long that I don't think they have to say it anymore. Because a simple trip over to Reddit, where you check out what people are talking about, they're talking about the disappearing middle class.
Yeah.
It's as if they've all been brainwashed and now they just spout the party line.
It's true because everybody knows it's true.
Everybody knows it's true. These people are all correct. They're just not exactly correct.
When they say the middle class is disappearing, the implication is we're becoming poor at the expense of the ultra-rich. And it's not the case. I produced this beautiful graph. We talked about it, I think, several episodes back. I remember putting it in the show notes. And I have produced this graph, good Lord, for each year or each couple of years for the past maybe 15 years. And the graph shows the fraction of Americans who are in the poor classes, the fraction of Americans in the middle classes, and the fraction of Americans in the rich classes, all adjusted for inflation, right? So we've done everything correctly here. You look at this, and over time, it is incontrovertible. There is an extremely clear trend here of declining middle class.
The obvious thing to ask at this point is, all right, middle class. That just means the place where the middle grouping appears. Definitionally, shouldn't we always have a middle class that's exactly the same size relative to the population?
No, because it's not middle in terms of number of people. It's middle in terms of range of incomes.
Theoretically, we could have a middle class that consisted of 1% of the population.
Right, or even more extreme, you could have a situation where everybody's in the rich classes.
Right. So, I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind, because that's going to be the first criticism we get is that, if you have quintiles, that middle quintile, that's the middle class.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, James. This is not like saying average or median, where, by definition, half the people are below the median. What's happened here is census tracks income levels, and it breaks it up. There's, what do I have here? 9 different income levels from under 15,000, and it goes up by like 5 or 10,000s, up to, in the top 3 are 100 to 150,000, 150 to 200,000, and then over 200,000. So everybody over 200,000 we throw into one, which I think is a good thing to do, because the way we calculate inequality measures, when we say things like income inequality is rising, the way they calculate those numbers, it's possible to see income inequality rising not because incomes have changed amongst the regular people, but simply because Bill Gates got richer than Warren Buffett. Right? Now, from our perspective, it doesn't matter whether you're Musk or Buffett or Gates, they're rich. What these numbers do is they say anybody over 200,000, we're just going to lump them into one category. That's the rich. So when we talk about the middle class, it's the middle of these income categories, not the middle of the number of people.
And how much is that income category?
The bottom, so you call it the lower middle class, is 35,000 to 50,000.
These are individuals, not households.
These are households.
So you could be middle class if you're making $35,000 in a household?
Well, yeah, but remember, household doesn't necessarily mean 3 people. It could be one person.
I get it, but man alive, that's not a lot of money.
No, it is awfully low. And, people look at that and say, well, that's not middle class, that's poor. That's okay. It doesn't matter really what you call it because the numbers are declining.
And they are constant over time?
Yeah, there's like 1 or 2 years where the decline accelerates or slows down, but it's a decline all the way through.
No, I mean the category is constant. Are we accounting for inflation and what have you? Are these constant dollars?
Right. So when I say the lower middle class classification's $35,000 to $50,000, I mean $35,000 to $50,000 in today's dollars. Wouldn't have been 35,000 20 years ago, be some other number, but in terms of purchasing power, it's the same as what we call today 35,000.
Okay, so that's all we're talking about when we're talking about middle class. Is that correct?
Well, no, it's not, because that's the lower middle class. Census gives me 9 categories here. That's one of the 3 categories of middle class, 35 to 50,000, lower middle class. Middle class is 50 to 75,000. Now you're getting into numbers I think people would start to agree with. Upper middle class is 75 to 100.
Okay, so we're looking at everything from $35,000 to $100,000 in income per household.
Yeah, and every one of those 3 categories displays this same phenomenon of decline.
All 3?
All 3 of them individually are displaying this decline.
How about that?
And it's a marked decline.
How much of a decline have we seen and over what period of time?
If you take these 3 categories together, that's the middle class. In 1970, 51% of us fell into that. As of 2022, only 39%. So we went from over half to approaching a third.
That's actually quite a big difference.
It's a huge difference, yeah.
How many of those people moved up versus how many of them moved down?
Yeah, so there's an interesting question that this particular data set doesn't answer because it's not tracking individuals. There are data sets that do that, and as you can imagine, it's a difficult thing to do. This one isn't tracking the individuals, but what we can do is kind of get an approximation to what you're looking at by asking the question, okay, we've got this decline in the middle class, what's happening with the poor classes? Because if the poor classes are going up, then I can conclude that there are a bunch of people in the middle class who are falling into the poor classes.
And that's the implication. When people say the middle class is disappearing, they are not saying that everybody's getting richer. They're saying everybody's getting poorer.
Yeah, and if you look at the poor classes, and there are 3 of them, just like there are for the 3 middle classes, it's the same phenomenon. Each of the 3 individually is showing marked declines.
And what kind of percentage declines are we looking at there?
There, it's not as large as the middle class, but the middle class was a tremendously large decline. Here we go from, in 1970, 30% of us being one of these 3 poor classes, to 2022, 23% of us. So we went from almost a third to less than a quarter, yeah.
27%, did you say? Or 23?
No, 30 to 23, yeah.
So yeah, less than a quarter. Huh. Which can only mean...
Well, it can only mean that, yeah. I mean, if you got fewer middle class, you got fewer poor, then you're going to have more rich. And that's where the number just really jumps off the page.
Well, what is it?
Now, here we're talking about, again, we've got 3 categories in the rich classification, 100 to 150, 150 to 200, and then over 200. Each of those individual 3 groups is showing a marked increase. In total, we went from 19% of us being in one of those 3 categories in 1970 to 38% of us today.
So we can say unequivocally, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting richer.
And the middle class are getting richer. Everybody's getting richer, right? Yeah.
Everybody's getting richer. Do you have any example? Because you've just given us the answer in terms of thirds, because you have 9 categories. Right. Is there any of the 9 categories that went the other way?
The only categories out of the 9 that increased were the 3 rich categories. All 6 of the middle class poor categories, every one of them declined.
So there's literally nowhere to look to find people who are doing worse.
Yeah, well, we have to tread lightly here because we're talking about groups of people. So certainly you can point to individuals who have gotten worse, but you cannot say in any broad brush manner that the middle class are getting worse or the poor are getting worse.
What do you make of all the recent headlines about people making over $100,000 a year who are inexplicably living from paycheck to paycheck?
Well, yeah, and that's fascinating to me because if you ask them, okay, you're living paycheck to paycheck, what are you spending on? And they'll start to list out the things they're spending on. And so many of the things they think of, we all think of today as necessities. I've got to have broadband. I've got to have a cell phone. We've got to have 2 cars, right? Whatever it is. 30, 40 years ago, those were luxuries. In fact, some of them didn't even exist. And so I think we've come to this point where we're living paycheck to paycheck, not because our incomes are worse, but because we've jacked up our spending to match our incomes.
So we have so many options that we're bankrupting ourselves, taking advantage of them.
Yeah, we're getting bigger paychecks and spending the whole thing and thinking that we have to because these things that we should be thinking of as luxuries, we think of as necessities.
All right, what's the political angle here?
Before I get to the political angle, I want to drive this home just a little bit more. This trend that I've been tracking for 15 years now of declining poor classes, declining middle classes, increasing rich classes, this has gone on from 1970 to 2022, so whatever that is, 30, 50, 52 years, right? If it continues not even half as long as it's been going on, by 2054, 30 years from now, only 10% of us will be poor. Only 40% of us will be middle class, and 50% of us will be in the rich classes.
And how steady over time have the trends been? Can you make that prediction with a certain amount of confidence?
You're asking a question that is difficult to describe verbally. Let me say that the trends have been pretty consistent. And by pretty consistent, I mean the ones that are going down year after year after year. The ones that are going up year after year after year, plus or minus a little bit of noise.
And so the line is pretty solid.
Yeah.
So you can make predictions.
I can say quite comfortably, if everything continues for the next 30 years as it had for the past 52 years, then by 2054, half of us will be in the rich classes. Only 10% of us will be poor.
Absent some kind of nuclear encounter, this is probably what's going to happen.
And anybody who hears that and thinks, well, that's just crazy talk, I refer you to what's happened to the world over the past 50 years. Because 50 years ago, worldwide, there were, and I'm doing this from memory, so I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like 40% of the world, 30% of the world lived in poverty. Today, it's less than 10%.
Oh, it was way more than 30.
Yeah, that number has been going down dramatically. Oh, and it started at, and this would have been like 100 years ago, it started at like 98%. Yeah.
90%, yeah.
That number has been like a roller coaster going straight down. And I'm seeing the same phenomenon here when you talk about American household incomes. With this caveat that you pointed out, and I don't know how to get around it, that we aren't thankful for what we have. We get something new, we get something better, and very quickly we take it for granted. And of course I need to have this thing.
One might even say entitled.
Yeah, entitled is probably a good term. And look, take something very simple, James. You look at a house that doesn't have air conditioning, you say, well, that's a poor household, and we need to do something about that. When I was a kid, I grew up in an upper middle income household. We got air conditioning for the first time when I was like 16 years old.
I remember when we got our first air conditioner, it was this behemoth of a thing that they heaved into the window in the kitchen, and we all left our bedroom doors open, hoping that it would reach.
Yeah, it wasn't HVAC with a vent in every room. It air conditioned one room. And if you were really hot, you went and hung out in that room and you were cool because you had air conditioning.
Sure. There were days that we all just kind of sat in the kitchen.
Yeah, but here's this thing that a generation ago was considered something that only, the wealthy or near wealthy had. Now, not only does everybody have it, but we think that there's a serious problem if a household doesn't have it. Do the same thing with 2 cars. Most families, when I was growing up, by most, I mean almost everybody, had 1 car. You just shared it, right? I think the average now for the United States is over 2.
Children drive cars too.
2 adults plus a kid, yeah. But a kid having a car when we were growing up, oh my God, that was incredibly rare.
I remember asking for one, and my parents said,
laughing,
that I should perhaps go get a job of some kind.
Yeah,
paid money if I wanted to buy a car.
Now, I say these things and people come back at me and say things like, well, what you're really saying is people just need to not be looking for more and just be satisfied with being poor. That's not what I'm saying. It's in our nature. Of course, we want to better our lives for ourselves and then for our children, even more than that, and for their children and so forth. Everybody wants to move forward. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, as you do move forward, don't take for granted the things that you have. Every time I turn on the faucet in the kitchen, I try to remind myself, I don't do it all the time, but I try to remind myself, I'm getting water in my house at the touch of a switch, and I don't have to worry about, am I going to get dysentery from it or whatever? It's clean.
You can even get hot water.
Oh, yes. If I want hot water, I just move the tap in the other direction. This is astounding. 100 years ago, middle-class families didn't have this. Rich families had the cold, but not the hot.
The thing to remember here is that when you hear the nonsense from the political class and the acolytes of the political class, that the middle class is disappearing, ask yourself where it went, because it is disappearing. Mm-hmm. It's just a happy story. Nobody expects that to be the answer somehow. This I don't understand, right? Because they live in a world of relative abundance. How they can't see that their lives are better than their grandparents' lives is well beyond me.
They miss the point in part because they see on the news, and the news showcases this person who's living on the street or this family of 4 that can't afford food or whatever it is, and your heart goes out to them, and absolutely it should. Absolutely it should. But be careful you don't take the next step and think that what you're seeing is common. It's not. It's uncommon. It doesn't mean it's not important and we shouldn't think about what we can do to make it better, but keep in your mind it's not the norm. Do you have anything else to say about that?
I really don't.
James is just looking at me.
Well, I guess we're done here.
Are we done?
Have a nice week, everybody.
I guess so. I don't have anything else interesting to say about this.
We'll be back when Joe Biden says the middle class is disappearing, and then Donald Trump says, yes, it is disappearing. And they all have all kinds of policies that will bring it back, never realizing that we don't want it back.
Yeah, we don't want a growing middle class. We want to just keep going the way we've been going.
Let's keep right on going the way we are.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.